Morning. My name is Paul Blough. I'm the pastor at Barnett's Creek Baptist Church, where I've served for the last 7 years. Some of you know me from my work at Blough Tech. I founded that company 26 years ago, a long time ago now. And some of you may know me from my other leg to the three-legged stool of my life, which is foster care. And my wife and I, Kim, have been foster parents for the last 30 years, right at 30 years. Coming up this year, and that's really what I'm here to talk to you about today. But you know, I don't really want to talk too much about myself. I probably need to create just a little bit of clarity, and then we're going to go to God's Word where we really will get the truths. I am passionate about taking care of foster children and the whole ministry that involves that. Now, you're not going to find the word foster in the Bible. You'll find the word orphan. And that's why typically in church it's called orphan care or orphan care ministries if you go to look and try to learn anything about it. But really when we talk about orphan care ministry in church, it's the same thing as that we today would call foster care. Orphanages as such have fallen out, and even group homes that are still used somewhat today are falling out of favor. And really what the studies have showed is that it's much better to keep kids inside of family structures as normal as possible. And so this idea of fostering really is what's taken over the last 100 years and really is even getting stronger in the last couple of years. A little bit of background with me in foster care. Kim and I have been involved, I said, for about 30 years. We've had about 120 placements in that period of time. We have 3 biological children. It means they came the hard way for Kim, easy way for me, except for in the case of Brittany, where I got a little bit too close during the delivery process, and Kim got a hold of my neck and almost broke it during one of those contractions. And so I learned to stay far away, take a good step away and be supportive, but coach from a distance. The other children that we have in our lives, we have 6 additional kids that we have adopted. And then we raised our great niece as our own daughter as well. So she was already family, so it was kind of strange for her to change the names from aunt and uncle to dad and mom. So we kind of kept that relationship, but she's our daughter for all practical purposes. If you do the math, 3 plus 6 plus 1, that's 10. 10's a lot. And we've been busy, and like I said, about 120 kids that have gone through our home from all different aspects. Some of them have been in just a few hours. Some of them have stayed with us for 3 years, and some of them stayed forever. We never got into foster care with the idea of adopting. We got into it to be able to be that transition home, to be able to stand in the gap for somebody while they were getting their lives back together. That was really kind of what our passion was about. But sometimes it doesn't work that these kids are going to go back home. And in some cases, it's just, they're yours. They may not have came the traditional way, but you just kind of know. And that's why we have the 5 that we've adopted, because they were ours. They didn't come the traditional way, but they were ours for sure. Kim and I have been advocates for foster care right from the very beginning. We were involved in reestablishing the local foster parent association, and Kim has ran that, and with a little bit of help from me for the last 30 years. So the Grady County Foster Parents Association, and we've been kind of co-presidents back and forth. And we went to a conference several years ago where we had the opportunity to be surrounded with other foster parents, and we got exposed to the State Foster Parent Association. It's known as AFPAG, Adoptive Foster Parent Association of Georgia. And I sat in on one conference too many, and asked one question too many, and ended up being on the board of directors for the Adoptive Foster Parent Association for the last 10 years on and off or so. And then last year, I didn't answer quick enough, and I became president of the State Foster Parent Association. You're going to find a pattern here of me not reacting very quickly. So then, as a result of being and I started back this 1st of May in that role, and so one of the first things that I did is I had to go to the National Foster Parent Association to represent our local Georgia state, and there's something called the Council of States, where all of the states' foster parent associations get together, have conversations, and again, I didn't answer no quick enough, and now I am the co-chairman of the Council of States for the National Foster Parent Association. So my wife kind of just gives me that dumbfounded look when I tell her things like that. It's like, oh, really? So you needed one more thing to do because you're not busy enough as is. I tell you all of that because not to brag on myself, but I wanted to create some context as to why, and I thank you for the gracious compliment of calling me an expert. I don't feel like that because I think I'm still learning every day. But I've had a lot of experience and a lot of exposure from a lot of different perspectives. In the trenches, doing the work, we are still foster parents. We have 3 foster children along with the 5 that we've adopted out of, 6 that we've adopted out of foster care. One is not at home right now. So I have 8 children at the house today. And so that's a lot. Yes, 8 is enough. If you remember the TV show, some of you get the reference to that. 8 is definitely enough. I want to share with you, though, a couple passages. The first is I won't even ask you to turn here because it's not going to take just a minute, but it gives a lot of clarity over what we're talking about, and that's found in the book of James, chapter number 1, and verse number 27. James is the half-brother of Jesus, we believe anyways, and he really writes with a lot of authority as relates to the early church, and he is kind of the contrast point in a lot of ways to Paul. So when you look at Paul's writings, James kind of takes not necessarily the opposite view, but he takes a different perspective to try to bring balance into the center. James says something that I found was, when I noticed it, and I'm shameful, I've been preaching since I was 15, and I didn't notice this until fairly recently. But James says something that's pretty profound, and it's that pure and undefiled religion is how he starts out in verse 27. And I thought to myself, that's probably something that as a pastor I really ought to know about, what pure and undefiled religion is. What's pure religion? What is religion? And it's really cool when we have definitions in the Bible, right? 1 Corinthians 13 tells us all we need to know about love. That's great. That's awesome. In Hebrews, we learn about what faith is. And we got a whole chapter on faith. And those are great when we get these really concrete answers to things. And so when we talk about religion, which is kind of what church is sort of supposed to be all about, it's interesting that there is a definition in the Bible, yet we really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. At least I didn't for a very long time. And so are you curious now as to what pure religion is? This is one of the reasons I didn't ask you to turn there, because I didn't want you spoiling it, because that's what we do, right? We read ahead, and so I didn't want you to spoil this. And so pure religion, right? I'm interested, I want to know what is pure religion before God? What is God, not what do we think, because a lot of times we get in America, we're very diplomatic about everything. We want to vote on everything. We're a democracy, and so we want to make a decision as to what we believe religion is. But this isn't about us. This is about what God says is pure religion. I find a lot of interest in that, and so it's really simple, too. Pure and undefiled religion before our God and our Father is this. It's important that he titles himself this. You'll understand that in a minute. God has a lot of names that he can call himself. When Moses asked him who he was, he said, I am. That's who I am. I am. I don't really need a name, but if you want to give me a name, we'll call myself I am. But we have, throughout the Bible, used a ton of different names. But one that's a very unique name for the New Testament is the name Father. It's in the Old Testament, it's only used about 13 times to reference God. We've always been taught to think of God as Father, but in the Old Testament, that's not the identity that he assumed. He references that only about 13 times. Most of that's very specific to Abraham and David. In the New Testament, Jesus alone mentions the idea of God being Father over 150 times. It's a tremendous change. It is the most dominant name used for God in the New Testament. Here he identifies himself. He can identify himself as Yahweh. He can identify himself as I am. He can identify himself as Elohim. He can identify himself as Adonai. He can identify himself as anything, but he chooses to identify himself as the Father. And this is how he says, okay, so pure religion is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Take care of orphans and widows. I'm not going to talk to you about widows today, but I need to create some context because you and I define things and we interpret things based on our 22nd century lens, right? We live in this modern era, this 21st century world, and we're always thinking about the future, and we think about where we are today, and we forget that this was written 2,000 years ago, and 2,000 years ago, women didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to own property. They weren't considered equals. In their world, women were about that much more than a slave. And I'm not degrading women by any means. I'm just telling you the fact that this is how it was. It wasn't how it was supposed to be. I could give you a whole sermon just on how it was supposed to be back from Genesis, but it's how it got corrupted and it got messed up because of sin. And so dealing with where things are, Jesus and God has to call out the idea of taking care of women who no longer have a man to take care of them. Likewise is true for children. And this is where I want to talk to you about. Children that don't have parents. Now, in many cases, foster children still have parents. They just have really bad ones. They have parents that are on drugs, or they have parents that have abused them. They have parents that have neglected them, parents that have forgotten about them, parents that have abandoned them. We've seen all of those things. And I could tell you many, many stories, and I'll tell you a couple stories, because I know stories help us to remember things. Where I do want you to turn your scripture, your Bibles to, if you've got them, or you've got your phones, you can pull out your app, is Job. Job chapter number 31 and verse 16. You may think that's a strange place to go to talk about orphans and foster care, but you'll see the context of it in just a second. In Job chapter number 31 and starting in verse 16, Job is giving a defense throughout this last couple of chapters. This is the last time that he gets up and he says, I'm a good guy. I don't know why these things are happening to me. All of his friends keep accusing him. You've done some horrible crime. You've done some secret sin. I know that you've messed up. And then Job continues to respond and says, I haven't done this and I haven't done that. And in one of those points where Job is defining why he is a good man, he makes this statement starting in verse 16. If I have ever refused the wishes of the poor, or I let the widow's eyes go blind, this would be the idea that not so much a medical fact with the woman, but in the idea that she wouldn't look at him any longer for help. Okay, so her eyes have gone blind. She's averted the gaze because he's not a helper. Okay, that's really the reference that you should pick up from that. If I've ever eaten my few crumbs alone without letting the fatherless eat any of it, for from my youth, really meaning from the womb, I raised him as his father. And since the day I was born, I guided the widows. Again, an allusion to sight. If I have seen anyone dying for lack of clothing, or a needy person without a cloak, if he did not bless me while warming himself with the fleece from my own sheep, if I ever cast my vote against a fatherless child when I saw that I had support in the city gate, even when it was popular, in other words, then let my shoulder blade fall from my back and let my arm be pulled from its socket. Literally, let my arm fall off. For disaster from God terrifies me. And because of his majesty, I could not do these things. Job may be the oldest book of the Bible. It may actually predate any other book in the Bible. It may be the very first. Nobody knows for sure, but it's a common thought. And so I actually really love Job. I'm very passionate about Job because I think Job introduces a lot of the ideas that the Bible then assumes that we already are supposed to know about. And so here, there is this revelation, if you will, 7 different thoughts, 7 different things that are brought out. These are the things that I would not do. I'd rather my arm fall off. I don't know about you, but I like my arm, and I really don't want my arm falling off. And the idea of losing my arm would be something that would be just absolutely terrifying to me. And that's how Job describes, if I'm not doing these things, if I'm not taking care of the widows, and I'm not taking care of the fatherless, in fact, if I am not as a father to the fatherless, if I've not fathered him from my youth, and I think that's incredibly important that Job points that out, specifically that even as a young man, even as a young person, even as a youth, that he feels that it is impassioned for him and essential for him to be obedient to God by taking care of other people. Even as a child, he should be caring for other children. In my family, when you have as many as we do, and then I have 7 grandchildren, Kim often keeps them as well. So there are a lot of kids at my house all the time. And we use a principle called elder rule, which simply states that the older children are always responsible for the children younger than them. It's a very simple principle. And It is age appropriate. We make sure that we don't have little dictators and bullies, or we're not trying to do any of that. But what we're teaching them is this idea that you're supposed to care for someone else. It's also, by the way, an incredibly good way to teach birth control. Because if you have daughters who have changed about 12,000 poopy diapers, they know all about how hard it is to raise a baby. And so you don't have to worry about them, or the boys for that matter, because my boys change diapers too. You don't have to worry about them near as much as you would otherwise. In our house, we use elder rule because we're teaching our children to care for other children. We've also learned, and we learned this one the hard way, that we always now, today, and I give this advice to any foster parent that I've talked to, we never take children that are older than our youngest child. We learned this because the older children always influence the younger. It always works that way. Whether you mean it or you don't mean it. Whether you have elder rule or you don't have elder rule, it's always going to be like that. And so we always want our kids to be the influencers, not the influencees. And so that's just a principle that we have picked up and that we have learned over the years. In this passage, out of these 7 different things that are said, 3 of them specifically call out the word orphan or fatherless. 2 of them are specifically to widows, and the other 2 relate specifically to both. Somebody that doesn't have clothes, or that situation. What I want you to understand today is how great the need is. I think that's the perspective that a lot of us don't have, is how big is the need? It's great, we support you, Brother Paul. It's awesome that you guys do this, and every once in a while you inspire some other people to do that. And, I can look out in the congregation, I can see several families that have actually joined in with us to help care for some of the kids that we've had in care, that have been surrogate aunts and uncles and surrogate grandparents. And it's just, it takes a village to raise the child, for sure. But how great is the need? There are over 500,000 children in foster care in the United States. 500,000. These are 500,000 children that have been forcibly removed from their homes. I need to describe that to you from a perspective that you'll understand. If any of you do you ever remember being at a department store or being at the mall when you were very small, like say 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old, and losing sight of your parent? Do you remember that? You remember how terrifying that is when you go and you think your mom is on this aisle, and you go and you look for her because you were running through the clothes like you're not supposed to do? That's what I would do. I could still remember that. Back in my day, the clothing racks were the store that my mom would go to. There was this space in between where the shirts were hung, and it was just big enough for me to get in the middle of it. And I would run through, and I'm sure that it looked very funny from the outside because there's clothes that were just bouncing out. As I was running through that, my mom would get so mad at me, but it was so fun because I could get in there and no one else could get in there. And I know several times when I was doing that, and I was in there playing and hiding or whatever, and I would come out and to surprise my mom, and I would come out on the wrong aisle, or she had moved aisles and she wasn't there. And there was always this deep-setting panic. Where is my mom? And I would start running, and I would get desperate, and sometimes tears would start forming in my eyes, and I would run around, and then I would see her, and everything would calm down. Imagine that if that wasn't just the situation that you found yourself in for a few seconds, a minute or two, but if that was your life. That if you had been removed from everything that you knew, the people that had always taken care of you to the best of their ability anyways, that a police officer or a social worker showed up, somebody that was strange to you in a figure of authority and one that spoke with power, which is scary to a child, and is telling your parents what to do, maybe in handcuffs. And then in the course of that event, they take you, and maybe you get one of your stuffed animals, but most of the time you don't. Maybe you get a couple of your outfits, most of the time you don't. And they put you in a car, and they smile at you and say that it's going to be okay, and that they're going to take you to a family that's going to take care of you, and you are brought into this strange household and told that this is now your mom and dad. Can you imagine how terrifying that would be to a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or even a 12-year-old or even a 17-year-old? How hard that would be, that everything that you knew had been left behind, and now you're someplace else. And you're told that these people now are your parents, and this is now your brother, and this is your sister, and oh, that school you used to go to, you don't go to that school anymore, you go now to this school, and you're going to see a different doctor, and we're going to have all kinds of tests, and people are going to probe and prod you, and they're going to ask you all kinds of questions. Can you imagine how intimidating that would be? And despite whatever abuse that they've gone through that's produced this situation, which is horrid. It's taken me a very long time in this ministry to get to a point where I can even communicate with the parents. And it took me understanding that in most cases, these parents were abused as children themselves, and that it is a generational problem, that it is just cyclical, that one generation does what they know, which is what was done to them, to the generation after them, and the generation, and it goes on and on. And it took me really understanding that before I could ever have any compassion on somebody that would molest their child or abuse their child. We have had children come in, babies, under a year old, with broken arms and cracked skulls. In a particular case there, the little boy, the mom had gotten beaten up by her boyfriend earlier in the day, and she was angry and upset about that, and the baby made the mistake of crying like babies will do, and so she picked the baby up and threw him through a window. Heartbreaking. But I'm going to tell you that the thing that is hard for us to unpack and to understand is that those children still love those parents. And as much as you want to hate that woman right now, I will bet you anything that she loves her child. And she goes to jail because that's severe abuse. So she doesn't get the child back. But every time that a kid goes through one of those events, it produces something called an adverse childhood experience, or ACE. It's a traumatic event. In fact, 50% of the population, even those that have never been in foster care, have gone through adverse childhood experiences. And if you've ever met anybody or dealt with anybody that has post-traumatic stress disorder, we typically think of it as soldiers coming back from Afghanistan or something like that. We really learned about it a little bit more in the two world wars. It's the same thing. It's just a childhood version of that, and it manifests itself a bit different. But all of the kids that we have dealt with, every one of them has been traumatized. But you know what's interesting is that the way you fix that trauma, the best way to create the resiliency to overcome the trauma of being thrown through a window or being sexually molested or being physically beaten or being starved to death near about. The best way to help them to overcome that, or even just the anxiety of being separated from their parents because maybe their parents were really not doing all that bad, they just liked drugs more than they liked their kids. And that the trauma that these kids go through, the best way to help them is by creating relationships with them. What we found is that whether it's soldiers or whether it's rape survivors or whether it's somebody that's gone through a natural disaster or whether it's a child who has experienced one of these adverse childhood experiences, the best cure, the best method to help them overcome is to make connections with safe adults, safe people. When Job looks at this passage, when he writes this down, there's something that struck at me. The motive behind why is it that he's like, hey, look, since I was a baby right out of my mom's womb, I was taking care of other people's kids. I was being a father to the fatherless. Why is Job so emphatic about this? And I know Job can wax a little self-righteous, but he was a good man, better than me. He's worth doing a little bit of that, but why is he so passionate about this? Well, he gives us the reason. He says, I'm scared of God. I am terrified of God. And I would rather my arm be pulled off than to not have cared for the orphans, because I know God would judge me. Now, when he says this, he says it like this: for disaster from God terrifies me. because of his majesty, I could not do these things. Now, the fear is a piece of it, but fear is two-sided. There's the I'm scared and I'm shaking fear, and then there's the I respect you fear. And my dad was one that inspired that I respect you fear. I was never scared of my dad in the sense that I thought he was going to kill me. Might have threatened to do it a couple of times, but I knew he wasn't serious. I wanted my dad to respect me. I remember this one time when I was I was a pretty good kid all in all, and my dad had gone through bankruptcy when he was 50, and so it was a very devastating blow when you're 50 years old and your whole life gets wiped clean, and all your accomplishments, all your money, everything is gone, and it takes a bit out of your ego. And so my dad is slowly building himself back up, both from a financial standpoint and then from an ego standpoint, and he's part of a social club that gives him an award. Now, it's a small thing, right? Just a tiny little thing. But it was incredibly important to him because he was rebuilding his self-esteem. And I had got home from school. My mom had to go back to work. This is how bad it was. My mom was working, and that was very humiliating to my dad. But my dad was caring for me when he would get off, and I was out of school. He would come and he would care for me. And I loved to go into the woods. This is when we lived up in North Georgia. This is above the gnat line, above the weed line. And we'd go up there and we could play in the woods all day long. And I loved going in the woods, me and my best friend. And we would do that every day after school. And this one day in particular, my dad's going to get this award, and I said, hey, can I go out in the woods? And he's like, yeah, but you got to be back by such and such a time. And we didn't have cell phones and all that kind of stuff. And we got out in the woods, and we were having the best time. We just went farther than we should have. And I could tell by the changing in the light that I'd messed up. And I hightailed it back. And I remember my dad standing on the edge of our property looking for me. And I come charging up there, and he said these words to me. He said, I thought I could trust you. That was it. That was the entire discipline. And let me tell you, I said to myself, he will never say those words to me ever again. And I diligently worked to never disappoint him ever again. This is that same kind of attitude that Job is describing towards his God. I wouldn't do these things. I wouldn't neglect the orphans because I fear God. I respect God. And I want him to trust me. I'd rather lose my arm. 500,000 in the country. Currently, there's about 14,000, between 14 and 15,000. It varies from month to month in Georgia alone. Out of the 15,000 or so foster children in Georgia, there is over 200 as of today that are free for adoption, waiting for their forever home. You can Google this. It's called My Turn Now. You just put it in your phone, and you'll see this wonderful set of pictures and videos of these great, awesome kids who are part of the foster care system who have had the rights of their parents terminated for whatever reasons. And these kids are waiting for somebody to say, I'll be your mom and dad. The need's great, right here, right now. I am not naive enough to think that everybody needs to be foster parents, and I don't think that everybody needs to adopt. I think you know if you do or you don't. I think you should open your heart and you should ask God that question. I believe God speaks to you. I certainly believe that to be true, something that's very true in my life. God speaks to me through the Bible, but God speaks to me through prayer, and God speaks to me sometimes when I need to hear him in very clear terms. I don't hear audible voices, but might as well be an audible voice for the clarity that it comes out as. I believe God speaks today. And I believe God will speak to you if you're supposed to be a foster parent and inspired by what I'm saying. It's great. More power to you. You need to be called by God because it's hard. It's a tough, tough ministry. It's a tough, tough life. But so is parenting. But if you're not called to do this, I do think that you look at this and you see that Job assumes that it's everybody's responsibility. He's not saying that it's just this group over here. Job's insinuating, and in fact, if pure religion, as James says, is to care for the orphans in their needs, then it's the job of all of us in the church to make a difference. And there's other ways of doing it. You don't have to be a foster parent. You can be a respite parent. It's a foster parent who doesn't take any permanent children. He just helps other foster parents. You go through all the training, you get all the certificates, all of the requirements, the home evaluations, the background checks, all of those things. And when Paul and Kim go on vacation, we can bring our kids to your house, and you can take care of them. Ask the Hammonds. Thank you, by the way. We had a great week last week. There's other ways to help, too. There's a ministry called Call to Care that's been started here in Georgia, and there's others throughout the country that have different names, but here locally in Tifton, there's one called Call to Care. It's a church-based ministry who has taken it on their shoulders to try to set satellite organizations up throughout the state and to inspire people to help care for foster children, and most particularly for foster parents, because we get tired. A lot of rules, a lot of regulations, a lot of things that we have to do that you just don't understand. And, oh, by the way, foster parents are volunteers. You may not understand that. I know the movies portray us as being in it for the money and for the check. If you do it right, there's no way you make money. We get a stipend every day for the child that we have in care, but it's just not even enough really to feed them. You do it because you care. My point to you is this, is that there is an opportunity to support foster parents through babysitting programs, through something as simple as, when we have new babies arrive in regular ways, we have showers, people bring diapers, and people bring all kinds of cool stuff. And when you get a child in the middle of the night that's in foster care, we get nothing. Most of our kids arrive with a garbage bag, if anything. Usually it's a garbage bag that's got some dirty clothes in it that my wife will go through and pretty much has to throw away because it's not anything that we would keep. We have an attic full of clothes. She'll go up there and get whatever is necessary, go out and buy usually quite a bit more so that they look like all of the rest of our kids, because we never want them to look any different than that. But participating in that level, just helping to create a clothes closet for other foster parents, having a place to share that, having other ministries, asking foster parents, what is it that you need? What would help you out the most? And joining in what we do. Look, my parents have passed away. Kim's parents have passed away. In the congregation this morning is Ron and Kitty Ellis. I don't mean to point them out, but I'm going to point them out. They are no relationship to us whatsoever, but they are part of our family. There's not a drop of blood shared anywhere probably closer than the Garden of Eden between us. But they adopted our kids as their grandchildren. And those of my younger generation, my third batch of kids, they're really the only grandparents they've ever known. And if they had not stepped up and done something that's kind of unusual and out of the ordinary and just said, hey, we'll be the grandparents for you, and stuck with it, too, through the thick and thin, because it's not easy being foster grandparents either. And we have foster aunts and uncles. And we have all kinds of support people and a great church that loves our kids. In fact, when I went to Barnett's Creek 7 years ago, and I was just going to fill in for a Sunday, and then it was 2 Sundays, and you know how it works, and 7 Sundays, and then 7 years later, I'm still filling in. When they asked me to be the pastor, one of the things I said to them is, I said, look, I need to tell you something. I'm not like other people. My family isn't always going to be white. My family is all kinds of colors. And I need to know that this is not going to be a problem. Because if I bring in an African-American child, or I bring in a Hispanic child, and somebody says something ugly about that to me, to my wife, or to my kids, I may not be a very good preacher that day. And they assured me that it would never be a problem, and it hasn't been in 7 years. They've been so supportive. A safe place to go. Learning about foster care. You won't do any of the rest of it if you could just learn about it so that you don't ask us some of the stupid questions. The worst question that we ever get asked is this: I don't know how you would do it. I would get attached. Like we don't? Oh, I couldn't bring a child in my home knowing that that child might leave in a year, a week, a month. I would get too attached. And we don't. You think we have some superpower that allows us to not attach? Child comes in, they need attachment day one. They need us to connect with them day one. And it rips our heart out every time a child leaves. And we do it anyways. That's the only difference. It's not that we have some superpower that we don't get attached. It's that we do it anyways. There's so many ways that you could look. And I'm not going to tell you, I've given you enough that the wheels should start turning. What could you do? Job thinks that you need to do something. Job would rather have his arm cut off than not to be helping out with orphans. You should be doing something. Don't have to do what we do. You don't have to do what I do. But you should be doing something. I told you that I believe that God speaks. I'm going to close with telling you this story. Part of my problem is that I've got 30 years worth of things that I'd like to tell you. I don't have 30 years worth of time to do it. Let me ask you a question. If God were to ask you, Father God, right? The God who's the father of everybody. If God were to ask you today, I have a terminally ill child that needs a home for the next 3 months. If God were to come to your house, knocked on the door, beautiful little girl, 5 years old, sitting next to him, and he said, hey, Mike, I got this little girl that I need you to take care of for the next 3 years till she dies. No, absolutely. You're going to say, well, but Lord, you could heal her. Oh, I am going to heal her in three months. If God were to come and ask you personally to do that, would you do it? I don't think that there's any Christian that would ever deny God anything. I mean, if he were to knock on my door and wanted anything, I would definitely do it. And so let me just put it to you from this perspective. Elizabeth came to us quite a few years ago when my daughter was Brittany. You're familiar with Brittany, when she was just a very young teenager. And her situation was pretty bad. She had 5 siblings, and they were kept in a camper in the back where the parents lived in the house. The camper had no power, no running water, no toilet. The bathroom that was inside had a padlock on it, so they weren't allowed to use it. Only the people with the keys, the parents, were allowed to use it. They had a pot that they were supposed to use. And Elizabeth got sick. She developed pneumonia. And they were scared because of their situation. The parents didn't want, because they were odd and weird and whatever. They didn't want anybody to know about it, so they just ignored it. The older children tried to get their attention, but didn't work because it's a very weird family. And so finally, one of the older girls decided that Elizabeth was going to die if she didn't do anything. And so she went to a neighbor and asked for help. The neighbor, of course, contacts law enforcement. Law enforcement contacts Department of Family and Children's Services. By the end of the day, all the kids were in foster care. 2 of them wound up at my house, Elizabeth and her youngest brother, a little bit older than her. Elizabeth came in, and she was a gorgeous child that never smiled. She almost died from the pneumonia. We got her straight out of the hospital, and she had scarring and all from the severity of that pneumonia. But she was just this awesome, vibrant little girl. Brittany spent a lot of extra time with her. There's just sometimes you make a special connection, and she focused a lot on her, and we all focused on her, and slowly we coaxed the smile back into her, and we coaxed the happiness back into her, and we coaxed the joy back into her. And flash forward a couple months later, and Kim and I were asked to chaperone a youth event. Pretty noble thing to do, right? So we get to go to Wild Adventures and take the church youth and help supervise a bunch of rowdy teenagers. I'd have rather been home, but anyways, take one for the team. And go out there to the amusement park, try to keep these kids from doing the wrong things and keep them on the right path. And this is before the days when cell phones are super popular. They were like about that thick, and so you didn't just tote them around on Wild Adventures. And eventually, they were able to get a hold of me through someone else. And one of the other chaperones who did have a cell phone with them came up to me and said, the pastor's trying to get you. You've got to call him right now. Something's happened at the house. And so we call him, and they won't tell me exactly what's happened. They said, something's happened. There's been an accident with Elizabeth. She's at the hospital, and Kim and I need to come now. And so we have to borrow somebody's car. We rode on the bus. We were on the way back, and I'm driving as fast as my wife wants me to drive, like 120, which is pretty normal for her. But I drive the speed limit, and I'm driving a little bit faster than I normally would drive. I'm in somebody else's vehicle. And you guys, some of you know me fairly well. Some of you don't know me very well at all. I can lock my emotions up. It's not a thing I would ever advise anybody to learn, but I can do that. I did it for the wrong reason when I was very little, because of something that happened to me, and I've turned it into something that can be useful for me in situations like this. And so I got the pastor back on the phone while I'm driving, and I was saying, hey, I need to know what I'm getting into. You just need to come. I have a wife here. I need to know. And I told him, I said, you know me. You know that I can shut my emotions down. I'm telling you, I've shut them down. I just need to know. And he said, well, Paul, she didn't make it. There was a drowning accident, and she didn't make it. And so I knew what I was getting into. Kim kept trying to ask me. I wouldn't give her enough details. She was figuring it out from the context of this. And so we get to the hospital, and we barge in there, and there's nothing can describe walking in and seeing a little vibrant girl laying there listless because she's not breathing anymore. I should create some context, and that is that she was supervised by a top-notch babysitter who was certified by the Department of Family and Children's Services, who was trained in CPR, who knew all the life-saving techniques, who simply turned her back for about 1 minute. This is per Elizabeth's brother's testimony. She turned her back for about 1 minute while she was talking to another child. Elizabeth flipped over in the float at that point. Her brother grabbed her immediately, flipped her back up, but while she was under, she gulped and dry drowned. And so she got her out, did CPR, called Cairo's Finest, were there in 2 minutes. They did CPR all the way to the hospital. We did everything right. But Kim and I, we got in this to save the children, right? You could probably figure out where I'm at with this. I'm a little upset with God, because we save kids. They don't come to my house to die. They come to my house to be reborn, to get life again, to be brought back their smiles. I struggled. It was a tough time for me. There's some great people. Ron McCaskill came and saw me, and he was pastor at First Baptist back in those days. He's a phenomenal grief counselor, and he talked with me. Some other people were so supportive. It was just a great outpouring from the community, but I was struggling. I remember sitting on the front porch of my house, having this conversation for the 1000th time with God, like, I don't get it. You send kids for us to save, and she dies at my house. And this is when I had the conversation with God. And I believe that God told me this. I think he asked me a question, the same question I asked you. I think he said to me, Paul, if I had a child that was terminally ill, would you take care of that child? To which I said, that's a stupid question. Of course I would. You remember, I'm mad at God. So it's okay that I talked like that. He didn't get mad back at me. You can imagine, God's a big father, and so you can beat on his chest, and your little child, it doesn't hurt him at all. So I railed at him. Of course I would. And then he said to me, that's what I did. She was going to die. But I wanted her to be happy. So I sent her to you. To make a difference in the life of a child is the most profound thing that we can do. And it takes the smallest effort. The Cairo Rotary program has a very simple program that they do at Eastside, where once a week, for 1 hour, some of the guys and gals, they go and they read to children that are at risk. 1 hour, once a week, during school season. The impact and the changes in the lives of those kids as we've done this program year after year has been nothing but miraculous. 1 hour, once a week, where somebody says, I care enough to focus on you. I see you. God is our Father, and He is the Father of the fatherless. In Psalm 68, verse 5, it says that He is the Father to the fatherless. And in Matthew 19 and verse 14, which Mike talked about earlier, Jesus Himself got quite angry when people tried to deny Him access to the children. I don't know what you can do. I don't know what you're supposed to do. I'm not supposed to know those things. I barely know what I'm supposed to do. But I do know that you're supposed to do something. Ask yourself what that is.
That's all I got. Right. As the band's playing, because I don't think you can sit there and listen to that and not be stirred somehow. Okay, and it might be some of us have some flashback stuff coming from those times where we were the one that was looking and mom's not there or whoever's not there, whatever that is. And I love the term "do something," and we don't have to foster for 30 years, but you may. As the band plays, the altar's open today for whatever that thing is. And maybe you just want to come and ask Him, what is that thing that I can do? If you've never accepted Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, that'd be a great place to start, because unless you have it in you, you don't have it to pour out to others. And I truly think He's calling somebody today. We believe in the priesthood of all believers, and that all of us are called to ministry. And so if you are part of another church, we'll let you stay where you're here. Or will we? But if you're part of another church and maybe that's not where you're called to be right now, if you're looking for a church home, we would tell you, welcome home. And Karen would get some information from you this morning. We'd love for you to come partner with us this morning. However He's leading you, the altar of the Lord's open.